The notion of God as a villain emerges from a thorough examination of biblical texts, and it challenges the traditional perception of divinity as an embodiment of goodness and morality. While many religious adherents view God as a benevolent and protective force, a closer reading of various biblical narratives reveals a persistent pattern of favoritism and vindictiveness. Through the examination of key episodes, it becomes apparent that the God presented in the Bible often adopts a biased stance, favoring certain individuals or groups while seemingly disregarding whole populations. This leads to a reductive understanding of a deity who is not a universal protector, but rather a capricious being who plays favorites among humanity. One of the most salient examples of God's favoritism is evident in the story of Abraham. In Genesis, God chooses Abraham as the patriarch of a chosen people, indicating a clear preference for Abraham and his descendants over others. This selection fosters a hierarchy that divinely legitimizes the subjugation and marginalization of other nations. The favoritism granted to Abraham and his lineage is emblematic of a broader pattern where God allows certain groups to prosper while overlooking those deemed outside of this sacred favor. Such divine partiality raises critical questions about the ethical implications of a God who appears to operate under a flawed moral framework. Moving beyond the Old Testament, the New Testament continues this narrative of exclusivity. The Gospel accounts recount how Jesus, a figure often viewed as an embodiment of divine love, exhibits discriminatory behavior that echoes his divine Father's preferences. For instance, his ministry predominantly focuses on the Jewish population, at times ignoring or outright rejecting individuals from Gentile backgrounds. In Matthew 15:26, Jesus initially refuses to assist a Canaanite woman, even stating that, quote, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs," end quote. This moment starkly illuminates the bias with which Jesus, and by extension God, operates, casting doubt on the idea that divine love is all-encompassing. The narrative of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt underscores another critical facet of God's character. While God delivers the Israelites from their enslavement, this miraculous act comes at a tremendous cost to the Egyptians, who endure plagues and horrors as collateral damage. This devastating punishment leads to substantial suffering, devoid of any redemptive purpose for those affected. By favoring the Israelites through such transformative acts, God exhibits a villainous disregard for innocence caught in the phenomenal struggle between divine interest and human liberty, presenting an unsavory perspective on divine intervention. In the book of Job, God's character is further scrutinized, revealing an unsettling lens through which divine justice is perceived. Here, God allows Job to suffer immensely as a test of loyalty, without any regard for the emotional and physical suffering inflicted upon him. Job's plight underscores a disturbing aspect of divine favoritism, where a seemingly arbitrary test takes precedent over the value of human life and suffering. Instead of presenting himself as a protective figure, God adopts an almost antagonistic persona, treating Job as a pawn in a celestial contest for supremacy. Moreover, divine commands embedded within the biblical text often suggest a problematic moral posture. Instances such as the commands to Israelites to annihilate the inhabitants of Canaan depict a God who incites violence and destruction toward entire communities viewed as unworthy or impure. This ingrained animosity towards certain people reflects a premeditated design to eradicate those who do not align with God's chosen identity, challenging the notion that divine will serves to support universal justice and compassion. One could posit that such actions reveal a deeply flawed ethical model being communicated throughout the biblical narratives. The very notion of a chosen people inherently asserts superiority and cultivates an environment rife with division and hatred. By prioritizing one group over another, the biblical God instills animosity between communities that could otherwise coexist on equal footing. Such an outlook negates the possibility of a compassionate deity operating within the framework of love and equality. The implications extend further, as throughout historical religious doctrine derived from biblical text has often been utilized to justify exclusionary and violent actions. The idea of divine favoritism has been manipulated to embolden colonial ambitions, societal hierarchies, and systematic discrimination across various cultures. Nations have harnessed the concept of being chosen to rationalize waves of persecution against those deemed less favored, entrenching systems of inequality that reflect the very bias sustained within scriptural narratives. Even when considering the acts of mercy and love encapsulated in religious teachings, sometimes the overarching message remains marred by the persistent threat of favoritism. Such acts often appear as anomalous exceptions amidst a dominant framework of punishment and conditional love. While one may argue that God's mercy is extended to all, the disturbing reality is that this mercy frequently appears selective. The biblical portrayal of God thus challenges the perception of a morally superior divine presence intricately involved with humanity's well-being. Rather, an analysis of the text suggests a deity who periodically escalates strife, breeds division, and endorses violence against non-favored groups. Consequently, interpreting God purely as a hero becomes untenable in light of the profound ethical dilemmas inherent in biblical teaching. In the quest for understanding moral divinity, it becomes essential to reevaluate the characteristics ascribed to God within the scriptures. To postulate that God is a villain does not necessitate a complete rejection of faith. Rather, it urges believers to confront the complexities within their beliefs. It encourages a critical lens, one that seeks to reconcile traditional interpretations with an acknowledgement of the discrepancies that lead to suffering and division among humanity. To grapple with Old and New Testament narratives is to illuminate not merely a story of creation and salvation, but a complicated human experience marked by divine imperfection. Thus, the archetype of God in biblical text reveals to us chilling truths about favoritism and enmity that might otherwise remain obscured by the romanticized notions of divinity. Far from the heroic Savior, God can thus be cast in the light of a flawed figure who navigates and shapes the world with partiality and disdain. In conclusion, the analysis of God's role within biblical narratives posits that rather than acting as a universal champion of humanity, God emerges as a villain whose favoritism and harsh judgments dictate a fragmented moral landscape. The implications of such an understanding compel both adherents and critics to reconsider preconceived notions of God as purely benevolent and question the ramifications of these beliefs within broader societal context.